Okay, welcome everybody to this round table celebrating some of the greatest hits of Andrew Gamble, forthcoming in 2 volumes published by Bristol University Press, one called The Western Ideology and the other called After Brexit. So the way this session is going to work is Andrew will give a few opening remarks to give us the context and background and where all the wonderful writings came from. We will then have a distinguished panel of experts to discuss the papers. We have Vivian Schmidt from Boston University, who will focus on some of the political theory writings in the Western ideology. We will have Simon Griffiths at Goldsmiths, who will focus on ideas around Thatcherism and neoliberalism. We have Ben Rosamond from Copenhagen University, who will be talking about Andrew's work in the context of the evolution of political studies and political science in Britain in the last half century. And we will have Helen Thompson from Cambridge, who will be exploring some of the ways Andrew's work explores constitutional and kind of state, the nature of the state questions. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to the man himself, Andrew Gamble. Whilst all of this is going on, do be sure to put some questions in the Q&A sections and we'll feed them into the discussion as and when we can. Andrew, the floor is yours. Everyone else on mute, please.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for attending this this event. The 2 books, it's been a project which has been quite a long time in the making and wouldn't have happened at all without the persistence of Stephen Wenham at Bristol University Press, who kept pressuring me to get on with it and get it finished. I was subject to some hesitation over it, partly that it struck me as rather self-indulgent to be publishing books of collected essays. Partly also there was trepidation at revisiting earlier work and earlier versions of myself, and wondering exactly what I might find. Some of the essays that are published in these 2 books, I haven't actually read since since they were published. And there was also the difficulty when I actually did begin to get my head around doing this project. I thought the difficulty was actually choosing the essays to include. Did I just please myself, or did I think about wider considerations? Fortunately, I got a lot of help from many people, some of whom are here today on the panel, and I had consistent support throughout from Stephen Wenham, and we decided at a certain stage that it would be better to go for 2 volumes, and we decided that one would focus on ideology and political ideas, and the second one on British politics and political economy. And although there's a lot of overlap between the 2, it made sense, I think, to separate in that way. The essays that have been selected they range. The first one was published in 1979 and the last one in 2019. So it's over a 40-year period. I was active before 1979, but I haven't included anything that was published before then. There are reasons for that. The essays, they're very little altered from the originals, apart from removing obvious errors and anachronisms. A few I added a postscript to, and I also have, each volume has an introduction and a short epilogue reflecting on the essays and the themes which they contain. What the project has allowed me to do is to republish certain pieces which have vanished into obscurity, but which, when I reread them, seemed to me worth rescuing. Other pieces are much more well known, but I thought some of them were also worth including. When I reread these essays, the thing that struck me most was it suddenly helped me recall ways in which I used to think and ways in which I perhaps no longer think. And I think that's always the way with when you revisit writings like this, that you find forgotten contexts and literatures, as well as you suddenly become aware of lots of absences and omissions and blind spots, things that I got wrong and things that I still think I got right. And it's a reminder too of how precarious political writing is. There are constantly shifting foundations. It's very hard to find solid ground when you're writing about politics. And political scientists, like political commentators and political journalists, are constantly surprised by events. And we have, the subject we're studying has far too many moving parts to be to find easy coherence. And this fog of events, this constant bombarding of us with contingencies and of paths not taken, means that the difficulty in understanding politics and studying politics is taking account of all the different contexts, both domestic and international, which shape political outcomes. And one of the things of going back to earlier writings like this, as I had to do in compiling these two books, was that it reminded me of some of those contingencies and some of those trying to make sense of politics without knowing what the outcomes were actually going to be. Another thing that struck me very forcibly, it reminded me of the importance of events, context, and people in shaping my writing and my intellectual development. And I make reference in one of the introductions to Enoch Powell and his Rivers of Blood speech on the 20th of April, 1968, which when I was 20 years old and still an undergraduate at Cambridge. And that speech had a profound effect on me and changed the course of my intellectual career, because it was the first time I really became seriously interested in the Conservative Party and in the split in the Conservative Party, which Powell's intervention represented, and also then attracted by the radical nature of Powell's vision, or his alternative vision for the Conservative Party, which was against immigration, against the common market, against Keynesianism and social democracy, and for a politics of national identity and free market economics. And it was those things which, it was the impact which power had upon me eventually, not immediately, but eventually, was the spur for making the Conservative Party the subject of my PhD research, and therefore and gave me a lifelong interest in following conservatism and studying it. Two last things I'll say. I mean, in terms of the context of my writing, I became aware that I use 4 overlapping historical contexts focused on the problems of British politics and political economy. The breakdown of the post-war settlement in the 1960s and 70s, the neoliberal turn from the 1970s through the 1980s and beyond, the New World Order following the collapse of communism at the beginning of the 1990s, and the crisis of neoliberalism after the financial crash up to the present, with the rise of populist nationalism and the return of great power rivalry. And two things above all, which I think, I hope, come out in the selection of essays, two things above all have always fascinated me. One is the drama, the upsets, the unpredictability of British politics in particular. It's rarely been boring or dull over the last 40 years or so, if anything, too exciting at times. Whether it's the debates on Thatcherism, the debates on decline, the debates on Brexit, all of these have enormously shaped my writing. And the second is the importance of the Western ideology, the doctrine which came to define Western modernity, a doctrine which was always contested and never final. But despite the ends of ideology and ends of history being proclaimed from time to time, the role of ideology in our politics has always remained central. And the neoliberal turn, I still argue, was a major development in politics, but also in political ideology. And it's still shaping our world today in all sorts of ways. The Western ideology and neoliberalism is no different in this respect, maintains a belief in the promise of modernity and that progress in human affairs is possible. And one of the curiosities of neoliberalism was the way it repeated in the 1980s, some of its advocates repeated old Enlightenment certainties at a time when much of the intellectual world was consumed with skepticism, doubt, and postmodernism. So that's all I have to say by way of introduction, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Andrew. Well, I'm very much looking forward to this discussion too. I remember being taught by Andrew as an undergraduate and being very intrigued and moved to take a great interest in political economy, so much so that I remember asking as an impoverished undergraduate for Andrew Gamble books for Christmas and opening them with great delight under the Christmas tree with wide eyes of a young child with a new toy to play with. And I'm sure I wasn't the only political economist who revered them in that way. We will now move through different aspects of Andrew's magisterial work, beginning with Vivian Schmidt, who unfortunately has to leave us in about 40 minutes or so for another commitment. So she's going to take the floor first and talk to us about that Western ideology with which Andrew finished. Over to you, Vivian.
So thanks, Ben. Thanks, Andrew, for a wonderful introduction. Actually, thanks for everything you've written. So it's, needless to say, a pleasure to be here, wherever here is for everyone. So in order to ensure that we have a conversation, I thought I would begin each topic by throwing garlands, of course, because naturally garlands are in order. And then I'd like to focus in on some substantive issues. And at the end, I'll ask a question. So 3 topics. One is Andrew's work as a whole and his trajectory as a scholar with a focus on conservatism. The next is, Andrew, your understanding of Western ideology, of where it has come from and where it's going. And then finally, I want to sort of dig more deeply into your discussion of neoliberalism as a philosophy and a political project. So first, one overall note about the book I'm focusing on, which is The Western Ideology and Other Essays. And I find it a marvelous book. It's got beautifully written essays with gems of insight on every page. It actually provides tremendous service in teasing out the political economic philosophies of different major thinkers, as well as minor ones, in ways that enlighten and explain. And here I'm thinking in particular of the essay on Hayek, or the essay on neoliberalism and the tax state, Dicey and Ideas in British Economic Policy. Actually, I could say this about each and every one of the essays. So most impressive about the work is the level of sophistication, the voice, and the versatility with regard to all aspects of Western civilization. It's about history and philosophy, politics and economics. And it seems to me that it's rare to find a scholar who deeply understands the vast sweep of history without getting lost in the detail, who can analyze canonical works of philosophy and theory without losing us in arcane language, and who can then set this all in political and economic context. So basically, all summed up, the essays are refreshing also in the clearness and approachability of the writing, such that even things that we know from our own reading comes out fresh and new. So first I want to talk about Andrew's trajectory as a whole. And I sort of asked myself, how do we characterize Andrew as a scholar? And so I'm going to focus in on the one that comes out in this book. A political theorist who has been an intellectual historian of political economy with a strong focus on the battle of ideas and the ways in which policy, and this is a quote, policy change follows changes in the climate of ideas. This is a quote from the chapter on ideas in British economic policy. But then we have to ask what kinds of ideas. And what's interesting here for Andrew, which makes him, I think, exceptional, is that we get both sides of the political economic wars at the same time. And it seems to me that Andrew's engaged in these wars, but arguably not fighting in the infantry on either side. So if we look at the introductory chapter, Andrew explains in it that he's really led a double life as a scholar, having delved deeply into both sides of the political, philosophical, and political economic divides. On the one hand, we have deep, in-depth inquiries into conservative thought in its many forms, including neoliberalism, a term Andrew made clear he dislikes, but he and I and the rest of us use for want of a better one. So on the one hand, it's deeply into conservative thought, and on the other, we get actually almost equally in-depth considerations of socialism in the sense of progressive, left social democratic, Marxian, and even Keynesian and neo-Keynesian thought. So we get two things at the same time, this sort of double life. And sort of thinking about this, it occurs to me this was really risky business, in particular at the time Andrew was starting out with this in the late 1960s and early 70s, when there were clear dangers from fascination with conservative philosophy by being tarred with the same brush. I suppose you could say the same thing about writing on Marxian and socialist philosophy, although perhaps more politically acceptable in academia at the time, it would also be to be tarred with a different brush. But Andrew somehow managed to avoid any kind of tarring, or to use a different metaphor, and I apologize for all of this, Andrew seemed to be able to sail between the Scylla of conservatism and the Charybdis of socialism without wreckage on the shoals of either shore. Okay, sorry about the metaphor. But I'm actually really fascinated by all of this because, so I started my own career a little later, but I was just as influenced as Andrew was by the political revolutions begun in May 68 and continuing into the 1970s. And I would never have been able to accomplish such a double act. I mean, I read my Marx, I preferred the early Marx to the later, and although I did read conservatives, those I deemed conservatives were Marxists I didn't like, such as Althusser. And then subsequently I moved on, but not to conservative thought. I went to Nietzsche, to Wittgenstein, then the philosophy of science and social science for epistemological issues. And I even read Oakeshott, but for his epistemology and answers to relativism, not his conservatism. You know, I come to the conservative neoliberal game much later, you know, only when it became the only game in town did I shift. But so, you know, the genius of Andrew was to actually look at this much earlier. So my question to Andrew is, how did you do this? Such an early investigation of conservatism was prescient and prepared you much better than most of us for what was to come. In particular, because you also investigated the alternative. So my question, you know, how did you juggle in your own mind, in your own work, these two very different fatal attractions without being stalked or killed by either one of them? Again, sorry for the movie metaphor or illusion now. I actually don't think that you used either one as a foil against the other. My impression is that you dealt with them separately as different kinds of systemic views to be examined for their coherence and their contradictions, and for the very different kinds of truths that they revealed. So my specific question is not, did you like them both? I think you made it clear that you preferred social democracy. And we can see this also from the people with whom you engaged, the journals with which you engaged, as well as in your writings. But you certainly cohabited for a long time with conservatism and then neoliberalism. So why the fascination? And you gave us a little account just now, and it comes out in the introductory chapter with the Enoch Powell incident. But so why the fascination? Because you no longer believed, you mentioned in the intro that you started as a conservative, but switched early on, perhaps by late teens. Why the fascination? Because perhaps you couldn't believe that others could believe? Or was this really purely intellectual curiosity, an interest to get to the bottom of thought qua thought? Or alternatively, did Oakeshott have the last word, not by making you a conservative, but by making you a skeptic of everything, conservatism and socialism? So that's my first question. So next, back to the philosophical discussions in the book on Western ideology. So rather than rehearsing Andrew's arguments, which are nicely summarized in the introduction and of course laid out in the book, I want to provide just a brief comment on some of the essays and then raise questions again. So in the essay on Western ideology and the epilogue, you know, the big question is, how do we explain how we got to where we are today? And Andrew sets this in the past, in the history of Western ideology, with its focus on modernity. He sees it as the outcome of a process of building a particular kind of liberal order under the hegemony first of Britain and later of the United States. Both, despite their differences in tradition, are united in political openness and in the Enlightenment project with its faith in progress. But Andrew rightly sees a pushback from the counter-Enlightenment, the Romantic Revolt, how conservatives and even more so nationalists also influenced, or even in the latter case, sought to subvert politics. We then see the push forward from socialism to complete the liberal project fully, and then postmodernism. And then he asks, and this is, remember, there's an essay written in 2009, what future? We get a rehearsal of the problems, the narrowing of possibilities resulting from the triumph of neoliberalism, the seeming end of alternatives given the collapse of the Soviet Union, the hopes of cosmopolitanism, in particular, the universalistic principles. And then we get, in the epilogue, we get a thoughtful discussion of the challenges of the future, especially climate change, and how different all of that is from the challenges in the past. We get a critical condemnation of the blindness of neoliberalism, and with reference to Hayek in particular, the many problems that it has generated, sort of the sort of problems of Hayek in particular in terms of essentially preferring dictatorship to democracy in emergency moments. But actually, what we don't get is what might lie beyond neoliberalism, other than a note that it's likely to be multiple modernisms. So my question here is, where do we go from here? Is this going to be yet another moment of neoliberal resilience, the end of neoliberalism, a renewal of more socialist possibilities, or something entirely new? With sustainability at the center of it, beyond Western ideology, okay, but how? And Andrew, would you give us an optimistic vision, say a rebalancing of inequalities, a solution to climate change, or a pessimistic vision? You know, we're not going to solve all of that. And on top of that, we have the dangers of national populism. So that's the sort of question number 2. So 1 is, who are you? And 2 is, where do we go from here? And 3 is, I want to look more deeply into neoliberalism. And for that, start with the essay on neoliberalism and the tax state. And this, I proudly say, was first published in a book that I co-edited with Mark Thatcher, entitled Resilient Liberalism in Europe's Political Economy. And it was a very important essay in that co-edited book, and a brilliant intellectual history of neoliberalism. Provides a kind of genealogy of neoliberalism, digs deeply into its many different strands, gives us a sense of how vast a conspiracy, one could argue it was, although Andrew, of course, never uses that term, but he does sort of show you the networks of economic thinkers, political elites, and business elites gathered together in meetings to discuss how to move their agenda forward. Andrew provides deep insight into the role of ideas in changing policy and politics, as mentioned earlier, but you get a sense very briefly, but brilliantly, ordo-liberals in Germany, the Austrian school, in Austria, obviously, and then economic libertarians in the US, the Virginia school, the Chicago school, and then we get it set against classical liberals and the origins of political economy, as Andrew explores the 3 types of households, families, corporations, or commercial society, and the tax state, all really, really interesting. So I guess for now, and what I want to do is sort of delve more deeply into neoliberalism. It seems to me that we'd all agree that neoliberalism has gone too far, accompanied by hyperglobalization and the rest. And Ben can tell us more about this as well. But where do we go from here? So again, same question. And these are naturally not just the questions I'm asking you, Andrew, but the questions I'm asking myself. Somewhere in the book you said, we are all neoliberals now. And I say to myself and to my students and to any audience when I'm asked to speak, how do we get beyond this? And here the question is, how do we explain change in history? Is this going to be a swing of the pendulum back to socialism, a kind of Polanyian double movement? Are we going to have a spiraling upward with neo-socialist policies laid on top of what has become fully neoliberal polities, as in a Hegelian dialectic? Do we get instead a Kuhnian paradigm change, whether Peter Hall's paradigm shifts or Mark Blyth's great transformation, or rather incremental change, so that what we see now in the EU, but equally in the UK, pandemic recovery funds, central bank expansionism accompanied by a push to address the green transformation and the digital transition, thereby essentially throwing out the extremely painful measures introduced by neoliberal and ordo-liberal austerity and structural reforms over the past decade. So, basically incremental change to a radically different future, so that 30 years hence we can say, oh, yeah, that was a paradigm change. You know, and what about the ideas? Is this going to be something beyond the dichotomy of markets and states, a rethinking in terms of a global, natural as in nature sustainability, in which the state becomes global in ways that match global markets, or not, but all in the service of combating climate change? Or, to finish, is this all pie in the sky with realism reigning on this parade? And I think I should stop here. Thanks.
Marvelous stuff. Thank you very much, Vivian. Excellent. Why don't we continue in the broad theme of neoliberalism and move to Simon now, because I think that was going to be one of the main sort of anchors of his comments. Simon, the floor is yours. Andrew, I hope you're making a note of all of these. There's going to be a lot of responses to particular points you need to make later on. Okay, Simon.
Thank you. Have I unmuted successfully before I start? I thought about calling my 12 minutes in homage to Andrew's account of Bob Dylan, Last Thoughts on Andrew Gamble. And indeed, I feel rather unprepared for this book launch, despite, as I confessed, turning up a day early when I logged on yesterday. And I feel rather unprepared in a way as a tribute to Andrew's writing. I sat down on Sunday, having persuaded my family to go for a long walk, to marshal my thoughts on these essays into some order. And 3 hours later, I was lost in a rabbit hole of research and wider reading inspired by the book's final chapter on Bob Dylan. And this is no coincidence. It's not the first time it's happened in reading Andrew's work. It's a tribute to the clarity of his writing and his engagement with his subject. Just as Dylan was asked to write 25 words in his last thoughts on Woody Guthrie and provided 1,700, it would be easy to overrun the time I have allocated, although rather more prosaically in my case, in discussing these 2 volumes. What struck me in Andrew's account of Dylan was his division between the songs of redemption and the songs of survival. The first of these are about the desire to change the modern world and change ourselves. The second reflect a skeptical gaze. These songs are bleaker, marked by crises or apocalypse, and are, as the name suggests, less about changing the world and more about simply getting by in it. And I come back to this distinction later. There are many strands to Andrew's work, and colleagues are going to be discussing several of them today. And I wanted to point out 2 broad overlapping areas that I think are particularly worthy of further discussion and study. Andrew's writing on Thatcher and Thatcherism, and on Hayek and neoliberalism more generally. And in particular, I want to reflect on those engagements, discuss their significance, and note some of their consequences. The first of these areas is Andrew's writing about Thatcherism and the Conservative Party. Indeed, if Andrew had given up political economy in 1979, or perhaps 1988, perhaps to become Professor of Dylan Studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth, his contributions to these debates would still be remembered for his popularization of the phrase, the free economy and the strong state, as a summary of Thatcherism. Although, as he has noted, this is a summary which has arguably been misunderstood over the years. The work was significant for many reasons. It provides an account of Thatcherism incredibly early in the project, but one which has stood the test of time. It recognises Thatcherism as a fundamental challenge to the political economy of the post-war period. It sketches the ideological roots of Thatcherism, which at the time were far from clear. And it recognises the relationship between the state and market, and in particular the role the state has in creating and sustaining a free market in the Thatcherite project. The later writings about Thatcher are important too for a variety of reasons, not least because they provide some of the best analyses of the Conservative Party, but also because they provide a way of exploring British politics that is attuned to the relationship between structure and agency, the role of Thatcher as an individual in creating change, but also the mythology around the view of agency and the structural constraints she faced. These writings allow us to see, as in much of Andrew's work, the contingency of events, the reminder that things could have been different. Indeed, at times in presents past, other futures seem more likely, and this would have led to very different presents. This in itself is a lesson in the importance of politics, and more broadly of political debate. The second area that I wanted to shine a light on in this collection was Andrew's engagement with Friedrich Hayek. For me, this didn't just lead to the loss of several enjoyable hours to analysis of Bob Dylan, but the writing of a PhD and then a book on the left's engagement with Hayek. Andrew argued that Hayek has much to contribute to the socialist project, and in books and several articles made the case for a kind of left-wing Hayekianism. Andrew wasn't alone in this. Raymond Plant and Hilary Wainwright were engaged in similar projects in very different ways. and the wider left at the time was involved in a variety of national settings in being forced into self-reflection by the electoral success of pro-market parties. Of these thinkers, though, Andrew's work is the deepest and most serious engagement with Hayek. I first came across these discussions of Comrade Hayek, as he was described tongue-in-cheek in the late 1990s, after finishing university and knowing exactly in which box I wanted to put various thinkers and how I should dispense with what I thought they said. Andrew's claim that Hayek turned out to be more right than wrong confounded these expectations. Indeed, as Dylan said in a different context, it was going to change my way of thinking. It's a laudable feature of Andrew's writing that he will engage seriously with views that are different from his own. From the earliest writings of the Conservative Party in the 1970s, which, as Andrew said, grew out of an interest in Enoch Powell to his account of Hayek. Andrew wrote of the contrast between Hayek the ideologue and Hayek the social scientist, and the extent to which Hayek failed to develop many of his insights because of the ideological closures he imposed on his work. The desire to escape the confines of any one set of ideas or methodologies and have an openness to different approaches is a hallmark of Andrew's thought, and one that many of us could and should embrace more fully. The examination of Hayek after the New Times of the late 1980s is important and replays careful thought and consideration. Above all, Andrew engaged with Hayek's epistemology, drawing out the consequences and contradictions of Hayek's thought. To Hayek, knowledge was irredeemably subjective and fragmented. Drawing Michael Polanyi, he would later describe it as tacit. The consequences of this for Hayek, of course, is that information cannot be shared or centralized by the state to run publicly owned industry in the way in which many Fabian socialists had assumed. Andrew's selective acceptance of aspects of Hayek's work was significant. It was part of a wider move away from statist forms of socialism, relying as it did on a devolution of power to individuals and involving the rejection of large-scale public ownership. Indeed, there is now a role for the entrepreneur in Andrew's work, although operating within a context of a far more egalitarian distribution of property. The state has a new role in normal times in preserving and indeed encouraging spontaneous orders, amongst other things. This seems to be a move onto liberal grounds, but one that was still recognisably of the left because of its commitment to equality. Indeed, to me, it seemed to be a revival of the new liberalism of the early 20th century, which was radical and egalitarian, as well as being focused on the individual and wary of state power. So to continue, perhaps even to labour the Dylan analogy, this is now a debate about the chimes of freedom, a disagreement with Hayek's attempts to make illegitimate those conceptions of freedom that were not limited to Hayek's own negative and circumscribed account. Here we move to a much broader debate about the role of freedom and the nature of modernity, something that is expressed in some of his writings in the Western ideology. Andrew's engagement with various thinkers who claimed in very, very different ways the dominance of liberalism, from Marcuse to Hayek to Fukuyama to Jeffrey Friedman, is part of this debate. The writings here are an attempt to challenge any monolithic understanding of Western modernity, and with it to reject an understanding of liberalism as Western modernity's dominant ideology, as limited to the negative forms of liberty that Hayek prescribed. Karl Popper described the attempt to combine freedom and equality as a beautiful dream, but it is one that becomes less ethereal in Andrew's engagement with Hayek and his wider writing on Western ideology. The writings on Hayek are part of a wider transformation of the left after the 1990s. The transformation of socialism, its merging at times with liberalism, the rediscovery on the left of constitutional reform, and above all, the chastening of hopes and aspirations. Many of these themes are found in the collection and are being discussed already today. The distinction Andrew draws between Dylan's Songs of Redemption and his Songs of Survival seem relevant to these writings too. Of course, the categories of redemption and survival are overlapping to some degree. There are times society, and indeed ourselves, need to change simply in order to survive. Over the course of any career as prolific and diverse as the chapters in this collection exemplify, there are bound to be changes of attitude. Looking at the contributions in this volume, I would argue that there is a change in analysis over time, a move from writings of redemption to those of survival. The recent willingness to raise the dual crises of nuclear proliferation, largely ignored in mainstream political economy, and climate change is an example of this, and an important one too. In the later works, despite the terminal crisis of capitalism identified in the Western ideology, there are no gravediggers, and nor are there any alternative economic systems waiting at the deathbed. Yet the move from a broadly Marxist position in the 1970s to what seems to me at least, to be a left liberal one, might be a move away from the writings of redemption to survival, but it never led to a writing of despair. Andrew does not share Dylan's scepticism about politics. There is an engagement with the liberal project, an attempt to promote a particular argument that is still of the left, a wager, as he concludes these volumes, that a better world is possible, and that individual efforts may, although only may, still count in trying to bring it about. More than anything else, and I'll finish here, however, there is an essential decency and humanity that shines through the work, as well as an openness and a breadth of interest which illuminates both of these volumes. Thanks.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Simon. There were many layers in there. We enjoyed that a great deal. I think we'll move to Ben now, if we may, and situate Andrew's writing in the context of the evolution of the study of politics and politics as a discipline in Britain. Over to you, Ben.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to participate in the panel. It's a pleasure, it's an honour. And I must welcome the publication of these two volumes. I've, for quite a long time, I've thought it would be a good idea for someone to put together Andrew's greatest hits. So bravo to Bristol University Press for taking the initiative, and an extra cheer for making it a double album. Of course, like all the best compilations, the choice of pieces is personal, even a touch idiosyncratic at times. And it's actually probably incorrect to conceive of these books as a greatest hits compilation. I suppose over the years, I've thought of myself as a kind of Andrew completist, in that I've tried to read everything that he's written, but looking at these volumes serves, I think, as a lesson that it's perhaps as easy to be an Andrew completist as it would be to be a completist of his great hero over his shoulder, Bob Dylan. And I guess that's a way of saying thank you to Andrew and the publisher for throwing in a couple of rarities and B-sides. So the volumes have been put together in ways that really speak to our ongoing and present preoccupations in the study of politics. And by doing that, the continuing importance of the book's constituent pieces is amplified and emphatically, I think, underlined. It's also refreshing and salutary, and I think this was Andrew's point in his opening remarks, to reread many of these pieces and to be reminded of the ways in which the scholarly analysis of political objects grappled with those objects in real time. So take the suite of pieces on Thatcherism that sit at the heart of the After Brexit volume. The earliest of those pieces provided my personal gateway to Andrew's work back in the 1980s, but situating them here within the broader arc of decline, Thatcherism, Brexit offers, I think, a vivid illustration of why it's such a good idea to revisit original text sometimes. Text that sought to make sense of a phenomenon as it was happening, rather than relying solely on retrospective captures of what the literature tells us. So I'd like to use the time that I have to think, as Ben said, about the relationship of the work gathered in these books to the ebbs and flows of political science in Britain over the course of the past half century. As Andrew said, the pieces in the books span a period of 40 years from 1979 to 2019. But as he also said, his scholarly career, as discussed in the autobiographical essay that opens the Western Ideology volume, stretches back further into the late 1960s and his time as a graduate student. As that essay shows, over these decades, the character of political studies in British universities has changed a lot. And while, of course, we must recognize that the preoccupations of political analysis at any time reflect the changing character of the external political world that we study, and as I've already suggested, that's very, very vividly evident in Andrew's writings, it's also true that the way we generate and communicate that knowledge is shaped and constrained by what we might call two internal factors. First, the evolution of the organizational sites within which we work, that is to say, universities. And second, the shifting norms of the primary scholarly field of which we claim membership, that is to say, political science. Now, I'm sure we could have a very long conversation just building a list of ways in which the sands have shifted in both of those domains over the course of the last half century. The picture, of course, is complex, and the two spheres, the organizational and the disciplinary, are indeed related in very interesting ways. But at the risk of simplification, let's think about one key element in each domain. In the case of the university, it's perhaps fair to say that the institutions of higher learning, especially in the UK, have become more market-facing, more subject to a logic of competition with one another, more exposed to new public management ideas about internal governance, and thus they become more metric-driven. And in some ways, they've been central sites of the very processes that Andrew's work has sought to chronicle and theorize, as Simon and Vivian have just noted. In the case of political science, I think it's fairly obvious that the drive to quote unquote professionalization, which I think is the defining overarching arc of the past 50 years, has come to be associated, at least in part, with a particular and largely Americanized understanding of what the best political science is. So those rather brash claims can and should be unpacked, and they probably need a lot more defending. But of course, if our world relies on bibliometric measures, let's say, to create shorthands for what good work is, which in turn, of course, feeds both what we teach and who we recruit as new colleagues and early career researchers, then the best political science must be that, by definition, which is published in journals with the highest impact factors and which is enabled by large grants from prestigious funders and so on and so forth. Now, it seems to me that the evidence provided by these two books shows pretty conclusively that Andrew's body of scholarly work is faithful to an ideal type of political science that he alludes to in the autobiographical essay, and that was fleshed out in his 2008 inaugural lecture at Cambridge, not included in the volumes, but well worth tracking down if you can find it. Namely, a political science that's open to other disciplines and approaches, driven by an encounter with problems rather than the preoccupation with methodology, taught through a balanced and diverse curriculum, and appreciative of multiple modes of political reasoning and the limits of politics. It's a vision of the field and its pedagogy that echoes, at least to my reading, the spirit of Bernard Crick's critique of the totalizing ambitions of the then dominant modes of US political science in his 1959 book, The American Science of Politics. But as Andrew's 1990 essay on theories of British politics, which is in the After Brexit volume here, makes clear, it's also anchored in a critique of the classical British approach to political studies. That approach was captured, of course, by the idea of the Westminster Model. As Andrew shows, the Westminster Model comprised a triptych of a constitutional doctrine, a theory of history, and a theory of the state that together helped to constitute the governing ideology of the British state. Now, it strikes me that Andrew's achievement has been to fashion a post-Westminster approach to the study of politics that also avoids the obvious downsides of capitulation to a version of professionalized political science rooted in the normal science of deductive, positivistic modes of reasoning. But this begs a few questions, some of which we might discuss. My first question is not so much about how easy or hard it has been to be the Andrew Gamble represented in the pages of these two books, but rather to ask about the difficulties of managing and building communities of scholarship, the departments at Cambridge and Sheffield, most obviously, that are first representative of the normative vision of political studies that these books embody, while at the same time navigating the choppy waters of organizational change and disciplinary mainstreaming that would seem to have shaped and constrained the possibilities for the generation of knowledge about politics within the UK context. Does, for example, the continuing distinctiveness of British politics, as discussed in the 2016 essay, What's British About British Politics in the After Brexit volume, to what extent does that create space for a distinctive indigenous science of politics in Britain? Does it still do that? Indeed, and this might be a second question, and I'm curious to know what Andrew and maybe Helen thinks about this. Cambridge might well be the last major university in the UK, and maybe even in Western Europe, to have set up a distinctive department of politics. And as such, it provides an almost kind of natural experiment to test the extent to which those organizational and disciplinary pressures can be accommodated with a vision of political science, research, and education that could, on the face of it, be seen as incompatible with those two logics. Or put another way, what were the key differences between Andrew's Project Cambridge in the early years of this century and Bernard Crick's Project Sheffield half a century before? Lastly, some thoughts about the politics of method. And now for sure, these essays are methodologically pluralist in the proper sense, in that they take as their starting point the key observation that there are different ways to structure and practice scientific inquiry in the discussion of political problems. And further, that the multiplicity of approaches is to be defended and makes for, indeed, better political science on the whole. But references to method are relatively rare across the two volumes, and I guess there are reasons for that. And maybe it's true to say that, at least for those of us who are longer in the tooth, it's probably true that we have to be less attentive to question. We had to be in our upbringing less attentive to questions of method than our students have to be today. One of the ways, of course, in which positivists have attacked the rest of us over the years has been to insist that their route to claims about political truth are more valid and more reliable because of their explicit emphasis on method, which in turn can easily lapse into an assertion of the superiority of particular methods over others, and indeed a Whiggish emphasis on scientific progress. It's one thing, surely, to insist that political science should be open and methodologically pluralist, but my question, I suppose, and I'll finish here, is how can those of us, and this is, for somebody who's obviously succeeded at this, how can those of us who seek to defend that position make a case for it that does not concede to the idea that some types of political science are more scientifically rigorous than others? Thanks very much.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Ben. Excellent stuff. Andrew, there's quite a lot for you to get your teeth into. I hope you've got plenty to say. We will pass the floor now to Helen Thompson, who's going to be our last intervention before we hear a bit from Andrew. And please, people, get some questions posted in the Q&A section so I can feed them in as well. Okay, over to you, Helen.
Okay, well, first of all, like everybody else, it's a pleasure for me to do this. I read Andrew's books as an undergraduate, as a PhD student. He was my PhD external examiner. 2 decades later, I got to teach with him. And I think it was 2014, Andrew, I helped to organize a 2-day conference where we spent a lot of wonderful time talking about his work. So that's a lot of learning that I've had from Andrew over a very long time now. So I want to say something about Andrew as a scholar of British politics, some of which overlaps with what a couple of other people have said, and then I want to ask him some questions about what he makes of what's going on in British politics right now, and what he makes of how we might think about it from the starting place that he adopted in the 70s, and whether he would start in the same place now. So the first thing I want to say is the pertinence of Andrew's starting place in the 1970s and the lens through which he looked at it. And part of what I say here echoes what Vivian has already said, but I want to come at it a slightly different way. And one of the things that I remember being taught British politics at Warwick in the 1980s was that, what I found anyway, pretty interminable Marxist writers on the reading list. Even though I was being taught by Jim Bulpett, there was still an awful lot of Marxism that he wanted us to engage with. But Andrew's work was different, or at least I found it very different, because he was a scholar from the left, influenced by Marxist thinking, but he was offering macro analysis coming out of political economy that was nonetheless directed at the specificity of British politics, and that seemed to me to mark it out quite strongly from other people who seemingly were starting in the same place. And that meant that political economy went hand in hand, as Vivian said, with taking the Conservative Party very seriously. It meant taking the politics of the Union, of the United Kingdom seriously, the history of the Constitution seriously, and the US security relationship seriously. And all these things come out in the After Brexit collection of essays. And if we look at this now, all these things turn out to be pretty prescient judgments about what was important. Imagine trying to make sense of the last decade of British politics from an assumption that class made Labour the natural party of government, that the Union was a given, that European community membership was simply going to modernise British politics and make it into another European country and wish Britain's constitutional history away, or even just about turn British foreign policy into French foreign policy. Now, obviously in the Union, he wasn't alone. There was quite a lot of interest in the 1970s, particularly the 70s, perhaps more than the 80s, But the interest tended to come from those on the left in Scotland and Wales who were seeing the Union in quite negative terms, and who weren't seeing its importance in high politics in London, and particularly, I think, in the Conservative Party. But that has turned out to be pretty consequential, the relationship between the Conservative Party and the Union. And I would also argue, and here I'm very much, I think, echoing what Vivian's said, that it was because Andrew had already taken the Conservative Party so seriously in the Conservative nation and had a macro political history that could situate the Conservative Party in the bigger transformations globally, if you like, of the 1980s, that his work on Thatcher stands out as much as it does. It stood out in the 1980s when I was reading it as an undergraduate, and it stands out well now. I mean, this is slightly simplifying, but I think I pretty much tell students that there are two pieces of work that are worth reading on the Thatcher governments, and that is Jim Bulpitt's Statecraft essay and Andrew's The Free Economy and the Strong State. Now, there's a number of things, obviously, in all this, and there's so much that we could talk about, but I've just chosen one because it gets me in part, well, partly it interests me, and it also gets me to what I want to ask you at the end. So, and that's the Constitution and its relationship both to Brexit and to the Union. And as I say, I'm partly doing this because I find it very interesting, and I know that Andrew's interested in it, but I'm also doing it because I think we in Britain are clearly or the United Kingdom, I should say here, we're in a pretty stark political moment in some sense, that there's a constitutional void in which we've left the European Union, but we haven't dealt with the changes that happened to our constitution during the years of the European Union that mean that we can't go back to the way things were before 1973. And at the same time that the UK Union's up against two significant secessionist pressures, both from Scotland and from Northern Ireland. Now, perhaps I'm fairly going to pick out a sentence from what I regard as the wonderfully titled essay, What's British About British Politics, and just read it. And it's slightly taken out of context, but I hope you'll forgive me this, Andrew, for getting to the point that I want to make. The sentence is this: perhaps surprisingly for the country that gave birth to Magna Carta, constitutional doctrine still maintains that there is in principle no law which a parliament cannot change, because no parliament can bind its successor. And then you go on in that essay to explain the ways in which, in practice, particularly since 1973, that parliamentary sovereignty was qualified, not least in relation to, first of all, European Community membership, and then to devolution. And you follow Vernon Bogdanel's argument that essentially a de facto new constitution gradually emerged during those years, though it didn't. Well, the question of how codified it is obviously quite complicated. But what I want to ask you is in retrospect, was it ever this simple? Was this the constitution that we had? And are we perhaps now where we are because it wasn't actually the case that the constitution allowed for the sovereignty of parliament, particularly in regard to the union, and that this is why we've got the kind of contest over the union, or we can have the kind of contest over the union that we're having? Because it seems to me that if you think about it, that the problem with the constitution, if you just understand it as parliamentary sovereignty, which obviously is the way in which it absolutely commonly has been understood, is that it runs into the problem immediately of, well, how do you deal with something that might be considered constitutional change? Because there's nothing that actually is, there's nothing that can demarcate what is a legislative issue from a constitutional issue if Parliament can just legislate on absolutely anything in a non-binding way. But clearly, if you look at the decade in which you started, the 1970s, there was a lot of problems with constitutional change, whether that be joining the European community, all the constitutional arguments, including those made, as we know, by Enoch Powell, going through to the failed devolutions of the 70s, And there are certain parallels, obviously not the European community part of it, but certainly the devolution part of it, that run quite strongly with the 1910 to 1914 period, which I think we would all agree would be was a period of constitutional crisis in British politics, and one that had certain similarities, I would argue, with the 1970 version of it, sorry, the 1970s crisis, at least when Labour was in power, which is that you had a constitutionally reforming government that didn't have a majority in England, that was trying to change the balance of the union by giving devolution home rule, as it was called in the earlier period, to the non-English parts of the union, and running into considerable difficulties in finding ways of legitimating that. So it seems to me is that there's a kind of, if you think about it, there's a kind of constant issue every time you get to a period that's constitutionally difficult in British politics, where issues of consent come to the fore. And no, actually what we've seen then over the last decade is we've seen two big referendums around consent, whether the Scottish people consent to continue to be in the UK Union, and whether the collective British people consent to be in the European Union. And the answer to the second was that they didn't, and the government chose to act on it, although that turned out to be quite a very, very complicated thing to do. And we could yet have another referendum on Scottish independence. We could have a border poll in Northern Ireland. We seem very willing, what I'm trying to say is we seem very willing actually to put these questions of consent to the Constitution, particularly, but not only in relation to the Union, to the test of whether voters actually consent to it. If you think about it, that's pretty hard to reconcile with the idea that Parliament is sovereign, and that's the fundamental principle of our Constitution. So my question, in a way, is how did we end up? If we'd all understood the Constitution correctly, how are we having this kind of politics? And I'm not saying I know what the answer to this is. I'm interested in what you think about it, and I'm partly interested in what I think about it, because it seems to me that in some sense, the more you start thinking about British politics, and you thought about it for a very long time, the harder it actually is to understand. There's something that's just kind of almost like constantly elusive about it, and so I wondered what you thought about that thought. But as a final question, what would you say to someone now who was starting off trying to establish a framework for trying to understand it? Would you tell them to go back to what kinds of things that you were thinking about in the 1970s and your starting places, or is there something that we've now understood that means that we need to stand somewhere else? And maybe that's more comparatively, maybe that's more historically. I mean, I've got an open mind about what that might be, but I'm very interested to know what you think about that.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Helen. Marvelous stuff. Well, Andrew, you've got one or two issues to ponder and to respond to there. We will give you the floor. And hopefully we'll get some kind of a conversation going, and hopefully I'll be able to feed in thoughts from those who are not on the round table. So do get those coming in, everybody. But for a while, let's hear from Andrew to take us through some responses to some of the provocations that were contained in those contributions.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for all those comments and indeed tributes. I mean, that was lovely to hear. But you did all raise some very interesting issues, which I shall struggle to do justice to. But I mean, Vivian, I know, has had to leave, which is a shame, which makes me think I could dodge her questions. But I would say, I mean, I have wondered about that myself, about how I came to why the approach I came to adopt, what its roots were, and I think actually the decisive thing was after Cambridge, going to Durham for a year and being brought into contact with Oakeshott's work by dedicated Oakeshottians, and suddenly realizing that there were these, I mean, at Cambridge, I had absorbed quite deeply a lot of the student Marxism that was going on, and the excitement around radical ideas in the late 60s. Oakeshott, of course, had been for a long time at Cambridge, but at Cambridge, I never came across any reference to him at all in any of the courses which I took. So he was a non-presence, at least in the people that taught me at Cambridge at that time. And I think it was that, to be immersed in, I mean to realize that Marx and Oakeshott gave completely sort of sealed accounts, alternative accounts of the world of theory and the world of practice. I think that was the origin of this approach. It gave me a respect for very different systems of thought, and it transferred later on then to when I became really interested in Hayek and to studying Hayek. And in a way, you know, intellectually, it is most of my career I've been having this internal conversation with Hayek and Oakeshott, and wanting to actually test out test my ideas against their ideas, and that has and that's because ultimately I don't agree with them, but it's actually I've probably derived much more stimulus from engaging with them than I have with Marx and Marxism, although that was a very powerful influence at one time. But in the sense of continuous intellectual engagement, Marx and the Marxist tradition haven't actually excited me as much as Oakeshott and Hayek. So it's a curious, it's a curious part of my makeup. I mean, I think Simon's comment about songs of redemption and songs of survival is very interesting. I hadn't quite thought, and the way he linked that to my career. I mean, actually, that is quite interesting. It's, in terms of the way my intellectual preoccupation shifted. That is certainly true. I became much more interested in practical questions and institutional design, and those sorts of the nuts and bolts of political systems than I ever was at the outset. And I think Ben is Ben's question goes to the very heart of a problem we all face as academics now. I think that he's absolutely right that both the organizational and the disciplinary pressures are such that the kind of political science I believe in and have always been attracted to and attached to, difficulties of practicing that now are much greater than they once were, and the whole environment has changed. Not so there's still pockets of the old learning, but but they are under siege everywhere, I think. And I do find it very, very sad that that the more pluralist and eclectic approaches, it's become so much harder to practice, and particularly for younger academics. I mean, established academics, it's much easier to be idiosyncratic, but it's when I compare with what young academics, what hoops they now have to jump through, compared with the very laissez-faire attitude to my own period as a postgraduate and as a young university teacher, the changes are very dramatic. And but I think that although these pressures exist, I think that the example of other ways of doing things and of other intellectual traditions are always, that people will always seek them out, and that's, you know, what I hope for the future, that there will always be dissidents, because and frankly I still think that some of the more pluralist and eclectic methods of studying politics are actually yield more insight in the end, and yield more understanding, and in the end people are going to be attracted to that. And the dangers always of all academic disciplines, particularly in the social sciences and the humanities, is that they turn in on themselves and they become scholastic, and they don't actually help to explain things any longer. But I recognize what Ben is saying about the increasing difficulties of juggling the pressures on us. And finally, Helen's points. Yes, I mean, that is an extraordinarily interesting way of putting it about the Constitution and the and I don't have an answer to that. I mean, the one thing I felt is I think I wouldn't start from where, I think you have to start from where we are at this moment, post Brexit and post the devolution settlements. I mean, we are in a very different sort of polity now. But what seems to have happened and how it's happened is very curious, particularly because the Conservative Party was always such a bulwark against allowing any form of direct democracy into the British Constitution, so that there are numerous conservative constitutional authorities, and Enoch Powell himself, I mean, who were completely against the idea of referendums. And so the way that the referendum, I mean, obviously first introduced by Harold Wilson to solve his internal political problem in 1975, but the way that the referendum has now achieved the degree of authority it has for settling constitutional questions is a very surprising development. And I agree that it does contradict that older notion of parliamentary sovereignty, which was, I mean, it did celebrate the indirect nature of popular control, and the trying to mix these two principles of parliamentary sovereignty and popular sovereignty, direct popular sovereignty, is a very tricky thing to do. And it's very, I think the starting point would have to be to look at it comparatively, and because I think it is very interesting, those democracies which will have nothing to do with referendums, like the United States, like Germany, and those that make full allowance for it. And actually, at the other extreme, you have Switzerland, and different way. I think what's the British, like so often in their constitutional history, stumbled into this, and nobody really stopped to think, what are we doing here? Why are we introducing a principle which is going to create such difficulties and tensions for us? And it actually, the 2017-19 Parliament will be looked at by political scientists for decades ahead, as an example where these two principles clashed and trying to reconcile popular sovereignty and parliamentary sovereignty in a government that had lost its majority, was a very uncomfortable period in British politics, and has now been resolved. But the underlying question, seems to me, has not been resolved, and so that the constitutional issues for the future are enormous, of how you actually, and indeed many particular things which the Johnson government has done, raised very sort of troubling questions about what is now understood as the settled nature of the Constitution. So I think that the Constitution is going to be, and not least, as you say, because of the secessionist pressures in Scotland and Northern Ireland, this is going to be a continuing source of conflict, but also of interest for students of politics. There's other things I know I haven't picked up, but let me pass back to Ben.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we can sort of kick around one or two further themes. I'll let anyone come back in with any thoughts they have. I've just got one that follows on from where you just ended, Andrew, which is, obviously it's called the Conservative and Unionist Party, but the conduct of the Boris Johnson administration suggests that that's not really what the Conservative Party is anymore. And so what do you think happens to Conservative ideology when it's kind of cut loose its commitment to the Union? Can it kind of sustain itself, or how does it evolve in light of the Union ceasing to be a core element of the identity of what it is to hold to the Conservative tradition?
I think that, well, I at one time I thought that there might become a much stronger movement within the Conservative Party to actually ditch the Union. I mean, there was a time when people like Simon Heffer were sort of following through the logic of Powell's position, and actually Simon Heffer was talking in particular about Scotland, but actually Scotland was it wouldn't be a loss if Scotland changed, if Scotland was no longer part of the Union, if they didn't want to be, and it would be an incubus off England's back, as it were. I mean, Simon Heffer now seems to have changed his position again back towards a much more pro-unionist position, and indeed it's very hard to find leading Conservatives who are against the Union. But I think what is true is that they don't really have a strategy for how to preserve the Union. They are, the Labour Party is exactly the same. They have the Labour Party perhaps even more at sea, but the Conservatives are do have this extraordinary difficulty of now how to fit together the union, and you saw this with the uneasiness of the government during the pandemic, with the fact that often the Scottish and Welsh governments were saying things which were at variance to what the Westminster government was saying, and the desire of Boris Johnson to speak for the whole country, and then the constant realization that he couldn't because Nicola Sturgeon or Mark Drakeford were doing it, were putting their own spin and their own interpretation on events. So, and indeed often pursuing different policies. So I think the actually for the Conservatives, their big problem going forward is that they do remain, it seems to me, committed in ideologically to the preservation of the Union, but they don't quite know how to get to define that as a project which can unite the whole country, and they don't seem to want to engage in any more sort of major constitutional change of the kinds that some people are floating at the moment. And so they just want to muddle through, but this is going to be presumably very difficult, depending on, obviously, on what happens in future elections, but in Scotland in particular. But the tide is at the moment is against the Union, and the Conservatives, whereas at one time they always had very clear ideas about how they would unite the whole country and what the projects were which united the whole country. And you're right that a lot of the time when they talk a much more English nationalist language, which is much more related to England and England's needs. And they find it difficult to find a unionist language any longer. So it's something which hasn't just come up. I mean, this has been going for a long time now. But it is a very marked feature now of the politics of the United Kingdom, just how disunited it has become.
Fabulous. We have a few minutes left. Any more thoughts, interventions from our roundtable members before we give perhaps the final word back to Andrew? Go on then, Simon.
Well, only because it was a really big question and Vivian asked it and then had to leave. What's after neoliberalism in 4 minutes?
You're on mute, Andrew. Oh,
So I'm off now. Do we? Yeah. Hopefully we get cut off at 3 o'clock, so I don't have to answer this. I actually think that the neoliberalism, as we know, is very resilient, and I believe it's resilient, not just because of its history of the last 30 years, but also because it's rooted in a much older liberal political economy, which goes back 200 years. And I think that, so I think there are some things about neoliberalism which are not going away. On the other hand, I think that some of the forms of neoliberalism which we've seen in the last 30 years, I think some of them have run out of road, and which has been apparent since the financial crash in 2008, and then all the other things that have happened since. And I think also the rise of strategic rivalry between China and the US. I think this is going to change our world in very significant ways. So I think that what is going to happen is that there do seem to be some important ideological shifts going forward, which do mean some quite different emphases from the traditional emphases of neoliberalism. And I think we can see this in many different ideological currents, both in conservatism, but also in amongst some of the populist nationalist parties, and also some shifts that are taking place in social democratic parties. So I think the pandemic has accelerated some of these things, but I think also coming down the track, I do think that the response to the climate emergency is going to transform our politics. It is staggering, the scale of the challenge that is ahead, and how unprepared we are. And we thought we were unprepared for the pandemic, but we are so unprepared for the in political terms for the climate emergency, because it involves, I mean, it's so hard to see how in democracies, how you can make the changes that seem to be necessary sufficiently quickly to actually build consent for them. The problems just seem enormous, and so although the talk has begun of how to do it, I think this is going to have a huge change on our politics, and a lot of the traditional neoliberal approaches just aren't up to the job of tackling these sorts of issues. So I think there is going to be a lot of ideological change over the next period. How quickly this happens, because there is, in everyone, there is always a desire to go back to business as usual, to go back to things which we were comfortable with, we knew about. And after this pandemic, there's going to be a huge rush back, an attempt to recreate things as they were before the pandemic. But I think there are some lasting changes which are beginning to take shape, and which will probably come to see this the whole period of the 2010s as a transition period towards a new political landscape, a new political environment of the 2020s, 2030s.
Fabulous, Andrew. Well, no, that's pretty good. It's sobering, but thought-provoking as ever. I can only encourage everyone to go out and buy these 2 volumes. These will provide you with the intellectual resources to resolve the climate catastrophe or something. Thank you very much to all the panelists, to Helen, to Vivian, who's had to leave, to Simon, to Ben, and most especially to Andrew Gamble for these volumes, for all of the work that's enriched our understanding of politics and political economy so much. Thank you very much. And
thank you all very much. That was great. Thank you. Thank you,
Brilliant.
Helen. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Simon.
Cheers. Goodbye.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Bye.